Mr Chairman.
Call Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. And to pick up where my colleague Annette King left off, not only were those providers sold a pup, but the whole of New Zealand was. Because this policy is about nothing more than finishing off the job of privatising and destroying social housing in New Zealand. That's the job that the National Party decided to kick off in the 1990s. And Kevin Haig last night said he could picture the clothes and the colours of the 1990s, the pastels and the big hair of the 1990s. Kevin might have even had hair in the 1990s, who knows? But at that point, and actually, no, he didn't. He didn't have hair in the 1990s either. But in the 1990s, that's when the National Party began their ideological crusade against social housing, and that's what this carries on. And part one of this bill, Mr Chair, is all about finishing the job that National started in the 1990s. 13,000 state houses sold off in the 1990s. And every member of this House who is an electorate MP, if they are honest, will say that one of the biggest issues that comes in the door of their electorate office is people who cannot find housing. People who come in, we used to call it in my office the Friday 4:30 problem, when people would come in on a Friday afternoon with nowhere to live, nowhere to sleep in the weekend. Well, they don't go to the National Party offices because they don't get any response. They come to our offices and we work hard with the social housing providers to find them somewhere to live. This bill is a charter for the government to abrogate its responsibility for social housing. And what is more fundamental in our society than the need for shelter? The basic right of people to shelter. In our society, if people can't find shelter themselves, if people can't afford to house themselves, then it falls to the government to say, how will we make sure that is provided? And the national government's response to that is this bill to throw away their accountability, throw away their responsibility, and push that on to the social housing sector. And as Annette King said, the social housing sector's looked at this policy and they've said no. They've said, we can't do this. If you want us to be the people that take on the role that the national government doesn't want anymore, then give us some money to do that. Give us some money to be able to provide that housing. But that's not National's agenda here. National's agenda here is to push the problem away to other people, cut the funding as they go along, and then blame those people for the situation that they find themselves in. But the extraordinary thing about this legislation and part one, Mr Chair, is the power that the minister gains out of this. The power that the minister gains to enter into, quote, flexible purchasing arrangements. What a form of doublespeak. What a form of doublespeak from the National Party. The flexible purchasing arrangements are to allow the minister to hawk this stuff off to property developers, to the people who funded the National Party's election campaign last year. This is about making sure, that's right, this is about making sure that there is a sweetheart deal possible between the minister and property developers. Hawk it off at a cheap price, make it try and work. But the fundamentals of this policy are deeply, deeply flawed. You know, we have housing ministers, and goodness, there's tons of them now in the National Party, can't actually come up with a decent policy, but there's tons of them. We have housing ministers tell us the problem with the social housing stock is it's poorly configured in the wrong place. So the solution to this is to sell the poorly configured housing in the wrong place to somebody else. And somehow that'll solve it. Somehow the problem is solved by shifting it to somebody else. How typical is that of the national government to solve a problem by shifting it to someone else and blaming them for not sorting it out? That's what part one of this bill is fundamentally about, Mr Chair. It's about a national government with no real plan for how to make the lives of people in social housing better, and they would rather flick the problem off. So the questions for the Minister and the Chair are important. Why are these flexible purchasing arrangements being put in place now when there are no social housing providers who want to buy into this scheme? So it can only be for the developers. And that's the question that Simon Bridges needs to get up off his chuff and answer right now, is why is National pushing this policy, Mr Chair, why is National pushing this policy through Parliament today when there are no social housing providers who want to take this up? Because it's an ideological experiment. This bill, this part one, should have been scrutinised at a select committee. It should have gone to a select committee so that members of the public, social housing providers could have at least tried and turned this pig's ear into something useful. But that opportunity wasn't granted to New Zealanders. Mr Chair, I want to make another point about what Part 1 does. What Part 1 does is finally kill off Housing New Zealand's role as a social housing provider. It's been there over 7 years. The National Party has come in and said, Housing New Zealand, you are a landlord. That's it. Plain and simple. In fact, this goes even further. This takes them from landlord to letting agency. That's what this bill does. Once upon a time, Housing New Zealand played a role in understanding the needs of its tenants. And how many electorate MPs in this House, and list MPs as well, have Housing New Zealand people coming in, Housing New Zealand tenants coming into their offices because Housing New Zealand is no longer there to help support them in their lives? And that's what I've got this question for the Minister. In this environment where all these problems have been shoved away, down the road here on the terrace in my electorate are the Gordon Wilson housing flats. They've been empty for 2.5 years. What is happening for social housing in a community like Wellington City? Now, Wellington Central is a wealthy electorate on average. But when you look inside the lives of people who got thrown out of the Gordon Wilson flats, their lives are not getting better. They need support from a housing provider that looks at their broader social needs. Housing New Zealand used to make policy about housing, about the fact that we might actually need a plan for housing in New Zealand, that we might actually need to think about the future needs of those who live in our social housing. But this bill, part one of this bill, says that's not the government's responsibility anymore. So they're not only outsourcing the provision of social housing, they're outsourcing the policy for social housing. They're saying Housing New Zealand's got no role. Now I know, well, maybe they won't actually because they appear to be mute today, but perhaps at some point a National Party member might get up and say, no, he's got it all wrong. It's MSD who are doing housing policy now. Well, good luck finding someone in MSD that you can talk to about social housing policy. Good luck finding that distributed among the thousands of other tasks that people in MSD have got. If we're serious about the importance of providing shelter to our most vulnerable citizens, then we would have an agency whose job it was to focus on that. And instead, what this bill will do is take that away completely from Housing New Zealand and turn them, as my colleague Phil Twyford said last night, into the public equivalent of Barfoot and Thompson, a real estate agent, a letting firm. That's not good enough. That's not what a responsible government does. What a responsible government does is take seriously its responsibilities to the most vulnerable New Zealanders. And just because the government, in Bill English, like some kind of Southland form of Rip Van Winkle, has woken up to the problem of inequality and poverty overnight after 7 years, doesn't mean the National Party's got a plan to lift people out of poverty. It doesn't mean the National Party's got a plan to ensure that we reduce inequality. After 7 years of slumber, to suddenly decide we're going to do something in this area. Actually, this bill is much more instructive about where the National Party is at when it comes to the most vulnerable New Zealanders than a small amount of money going into some families' bank accounts. This bill shows that the ideological agenda of the National Party is not over. It's not over. In fact, this finishes off one part of it and says social housing is somebody else's problem. Well, on this side of the House, Mr. Chair, we think the shelter of our most vulnerable citizens is a core responsibility of the state. It's a core responsibility of the state to work with the other people who are providing social housing as well as their own provision of it, not shove the problem onto them with inadequate funding. This bill thoroughly undermines what we have come to believe is important about social housing. And nothing has stuck in my craw more in 7 years than being lectured by the National Party about state housing and the legacy of Michael Joseph Savage and Peter Fraser. This bill is a slap in the face to the legacy of social housing. And if we go out to Fife Lane and then at King's Electorate, that's where social housing started.